What if the hardest place God ever asked a man to stay was the one place everyone begged him to leave? 2,000 years ago, an exhausted preacher named Paul walked into a city that despised everything he believed. And in modern America, a young pastor named Daniel Carter was about to face the very same impossible choice. Daniel Carter stood on a downtown Chicago sidewalk with a cardboard sign in his hands, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to throw it in the trash. The sign said, "Free Bible Study. All are welcome." He had made it himself at his kitchen table with a marker that was running dry. And in 3 hours of standing there, exactly one person had spoken to him. A man in an expensive coat had glanced at the sign, smirked, and said 4 words that Daniel could not shake. "Nobody needs that anymore." Then the man walked away, and Daniel stood alone on the busiest street in the city, holding a piece of cardboard that suddenly felt like a joke. He was 29 years old. He had left a comfortable church in a small town where people knew his name, where the pews were full every Sunday, where the older women brought him casseroles and called him "Our Daniel." He had left all of that because he believed God was calling him somewhere harder, somewhere that actually needed him, and now he was learning what harder really meant. Here is what this story is about, and why it matters to you. Whether you are watching this in a quiet house, or in a hospital waiting room, or in the middle of your own impossible city. This is the story of the first chapter of Paul's ministry in the city of Corinth. It is the beginning of the letters we now call 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But it is also the story of every believer who has ever stood in a place that seemed too far gone, too cold, too proud, too broken to change. It is a story about what happens when God sends His people, not where the work is easy, but where the need is greatest. And by the end you will understand why the place that looks the farthest from God may be exactly where He is preparing the greatest miracle of your life. But we have to start at the bottom, because that is where Daniel was. That night, Daniel called his old mentor, a gray-haired preacher named Pastor Wells, who had guided him since he was a teenager. "How many came today?" Wells asked. Daniel hesitated. "None." There was a long silence on the phone. Then Wells said gently, "Son, maybe that's an answer too. Maybe God is closing a door." And something in Daniel's chest went cold, because those were the exact words he had been afraid someone would say out loud. Not because they were cruel, because they were kind, and the kind ones are always the hardest to argue with. "Maybe," Daniel whispered. He hung up, sat on the edge of his rented bed, and put his face in his hands. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was standing in the footsteps of a man who had stood in the same place 2,000 years before him. A man who had also wanted to quit. Because before Corinth, the Apostle Paul had already tasted defeat. Paul had just come from Athens, the smartest city in the ancient world. A city of philosophers and thinkers of debate and brilliance. Paul had walked into that city and given the speech of his life. He had quoted their own poets. He had reasoned with their sharpest minds. He had been eloquent, patient, and wise. And almost no one believed him. A handful. That was the harvest of Athens. A handful of people after everything Paul had poured out. So when Paul finally arrived in Corinth, he did not arrive as a conquering hero. The Bible tells us the truth about him, and it is a truth that should comfort every tired soul listening right now. Paul arrived in his own words in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. Fear. Trembling. The great Apostle Paul. Think about that. The man who wrote nearly half the New Testament walked into the city of Corinth shaking, discouraged, carrying the memory of a city that had rejected him. And Corinth was worse than Athens in every way that mattered. Corinth was a city drunk on money and pleasure. A port city where sailors and merchants poured in from every corner of the empire. A city where success was a religion, where reputation was everything, where people would step over their own neighbors to climb one rung higher. If you wanted to find the last place on earth that would welcome a message about humility, sacrifice, and a crucified Savior, you could not have designed a better one than Corinth. And Paul looked at that city the way Daniel looked at Chicago, like it was impossible. Now here is the first thing you need to hold on to, because it is going to matter for everything that comes after. Paul was not fearless. Paul was faithful, and those are not the same thing. Fearless means you never struggle. Faithful means you keep going while you struggle. Paul was not a man who never wanted to quit. He was a man who did not. And that brings us back to Daniel and to the moment that nearly ended his ministry before it began. The next Sunday, Daniel had rented a small room in a community center. He had set out 12 folding chairs hopeful. When the hour came, he stood at the front and counted the crowd. 5 people. Then one of them got up and left to take a phone call and never came back. 4. Daniel preached anyway. His voice cracked in the middle. And afterward, one of the 4, an older woman, patted his arm on her way out and said, "Honey, you've got a good heart, but this city 8 churches bigger than yours." She meant it kindly. That was the terrible part. She meant it kindly. Daniel drove home that night gripping the steering wheel, and he prayed the ugliest prayer of his life. Not a beautiful prayer. Not the kind you hear in sermons. He said, "God, did you even send me here? Or did I just want to feel important? Because if this is your plan, it looks exactly like failure." He did not get an answer that night. And this is where most stories about faith lie to you. They skip this part. They pretend the man of God always feels God's presence, always hears the voice, always knows. But the truth, the real truth that older hearts understand better than anyone, is that faith is often the longest and quietest waiting you will ever do. Paul waited. Daniel waited. And you have waited too. In hospital rooms. Beside empty chairs at the dinner table. Through prayers that seemed to hit the ceiling and fall back down. But God had not forgotten Corinth. And God had not forgotten Chicago. Because 2 days after that ugly prayer, there was a knock on Daniel's door. He almost did not answer it. He was tired. He assumed it was a neighbor complaining about something. But the knock came again, patient and steady, and when he finally opened the door, he found a married couple standing there. A man and a woman, ordinary in every way, holding a covered dish that smelled like it had come straight out of the oven. "You don't know us," the man said. "My name is Michael. This is my wife, Sarah. We heard there was a young pastor in the neighborhood who was about ready to give up." Daniel just stared at them. "We're not rich," Sarah said, almost apologizing. "We're not anybody special. But we've got a kitchen table and 2 extra chairs, and we thought maybe you shouldn't be doing this alone." And Daniel Carter, 29 years old, standing in the doorway of a rented apartment in a city that had rejected him at every turn, felt something he had not felt in months. He felt like maybe he was not crazy. He did not know it yet, but he had just met his Aquila and Priscilla. Because that is exactly how it happened for Paul, too. 2,000 years ago, in that impossible city of Corinth, God did not send Paul an army. God did not send Paul a famous name or a powerful sponsor. God sent Paul a married couple named Aquila and Priscilla, tent makers, working people who opened their home and their table and simply refused to let him fall. God so often works through ordinary people before he changes extraordinary things. That night, Daniel sat at Michael and Sarah's kitchen table and ate a home-cooked meal for the first time in weeks. And Michael, halfway through dinner, set down his fork and asked a question that would change the entire direction of Daniel's life. "Daniel," he said, "let me ask you something. When you look at this city, what do you see?" Daniel answered honestly, "I see people who don't want what I have. I see doors that won't open. I see a place that's too far gone." Michael nodded slowly. Then he said something Daniel would never forget. "That's funny," he said quietly, "because I've been praying about this city for 11 years, and every time I pray, I don't see what you see." Daniel leaned forward. "Then what do you see?" And Michael looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I see a harvest that hasn't been picked yet." Daniel Carter did not sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, turning that sentence over and over in his mind, because deep down he knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could pack his bags in the morning and go home to the town where people loved him and the pews were full and the work was easy. Or he could stay in the one city that had done nothing but reject him on the strength of a stranger's promise about a harvest he could not see. And what he did not yet know, what neither he nor Paul could have known in their darkest hour, was that in that very city, in the dark, a message was already on its way. A message that had carried Paul through Corinth 2,000 years before. 6 words spoken in the night that would either break Daniel completely or change him forever. The message came 3 days later, and it did not come the way Daniel expected. He had stayed. That was the first miracle, though he did not call it that. He had unpacked the bag he'd already half filled, and he had gone back to the community center on Sunday, and he had preached to the same 4 people. But this time, Michael and Sarah were in the front row. And when Daniel's voice shook, Sarah nodded at him like a mother telling her son to keep going. And he kept going. But keeping going and believing are 2 different things, and Daniel knew it. That Wednesday night alone, again the doubt came back like a tide. He sat at his little desk and stared at his open Bible, and he heard Pastor Wells' voice in his head. Maybe God is closing a door. He heard the woman at the community center. This city 8 churches bigger than yours. He heard the man in the expensive coat. Nobody needs that anymore. And Daniel put his head down on the desk and said, God, I need you to say something. I can't run on other people's faith forever. I need to hear from you. What happened next, Daniel would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people, and he never quite could. He did not hear a booming voice. There was no light, no vision. What happened was that a single passage of Scripture rose up in his mind so clearly, it was almost like someone had spoken it into the room. And it was not a passage he had been studying. It was a passage he had almost forgotten. It was the words God spoke to Paul in the dark, in the middle of Corinth, on the very night Paul had nearly quit. Do not be afraid. Keep speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. And then the line that broke Daniel open. I have many people in this city. Daniel lifted his head off the desk. His hands were shaking, because he understood suddenly and completely what God had told Paul 2,000 years ago. It was not a promise that the work would be easy. It was not a promise that the crowds would come. It was something far stranger and far bigger than that. God had said, I have many people in this city. Not I will have. Not maybe someday I will have. I have. Present tense. Already. In a city drunk on money and pride, in a place that had rejected Paul, at every turn, God was saying, they are already mine. They just do not know it yet. You are not going in to convince a hostile crowd. You are going in to find the ones I have already been calling. Paul had seen resistance. God saw people waiting. Paul had seen darkness. God saw future believers already counted, already loved, already his. And Daniel, sitting at that desk at midnight, saw his entire city differently in the space of a single breath. He did not sleep. He called Michael at 6 in the morning, and Michael answered on the second ring like he had been waiting. I stayed up all night, Daniel said. His voice was raw. Michael, I think I finally understand what you saw. The harvest. You weren't being poetic. You actually believe there are people out there already waiting. There was a pause. Then Michael said quietly, Daniel, I don't just believe it. I know it. Because I was one of them. Daniel went still. What do you mean? 11 years ago, I was 3 days from walking out on Sarah and our kids, Michael said. I had a bag packed. I had a plan. And a man I'd never met before handed me a flyer on the street for a Bible study. I almost threw it away. I did throw it away, and then I picked it back out of the trash. His voice caught. That's why I knock on doors now, son, because somebody stayed in this city long enough to find me, and I was already God's. I just didn't know it yet. Daniel sat down hard on the edge of his bed, because he realized in that moment that Michael and Sarah had not come to his door by accident. They had come because 11 years earlier, another discouraged believer had refused to leave the same impossible city. The harvest was not just ahead of Daniel. The harvest was standing in his kitchen, feeding him dinner, keeping him alive. That should have been enough. But God was not finished, and what came next nearly knocked Daniel to the floor. Because that same week, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Daniel in careful, deliberate handwriting, forwarded from the small-town church he had left months ago. He almost did not open it. He assumed it was somebody from his old congregation wishing him well. He set it on the counter for 2 days. When he finally opened it, he read the first 3 lines, and then he had to sit down. The letter was from a young man named Ethan. Daniel remembered him vaguely, one of the many faces who had drifted through a Bible study months before, back when Daniel was still in the small town. Ethan had come once, maybe twice. He had never said a word. He had sat in the back, and then he had disappeared, and Daniel had honestly forgotten he existed. But Ethan had not forgotten Daniel. "I never told you this." The letter read, "Because I was too ashamed. But I need to tell you now. The week I came to your Bible study, I had already decided to end my life. I had the day picked. I had written the note. I only came that night because a friend dragged me, and I planned to leave halfway through. But you said something I have never been able to forget. You said that God does not measure a person's worth by their success, and that even the person the world has thrown away is someone God is still reaching for." Daniel's hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the page. "I went home that night," the letter continued, "and I tore up the note. I am writing to you 11 months later. I am still here. I got help. I am okay now. I don't know if you'll even remember me, but I needed you to know that you saved my life, and you never even knew it happened." Daniel Carter put the letter down on his kitchen table, and he wept. Not quietly. He wept the way a man weeps when something inside him that has been clenched tight for months finally lets go. Because he understood now. He had been measuring his ministry all wrong. He had been counting chairs. 5 people, 4 people, none. He had stood on that sidewalk with a cardboard sign and counted his failure by how many faces he could see. But God was not counting faces. God was counting Ethan. One young man in a city Daniel had already left alive because of words Daniel did not even remember saying. One note torn up. One life still breathing. And Daniel had spent months calling himself a failure, while a miracle he could not see was walking around going to work, calling his mother living a whole life that would not have existed if Daniel had quit even 1 week earlier. He called Michael and read him the letter, his voice breaking on every other line. And when he finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Then Michael said so quietly, Daniel almost missed it. "You see it now, don't you? You've been grieving an empty field. But God's been out there the whole time counting a harvest you couldn't see." And Daniel wiped his face and said the words that would define the rest of his life. "I've been measuring success by numbers. God's been measuring it by lives." But here is the twist, that Daniel had not yet understood the thing that would test him far more than empty chairs ever had. Because finding out that God had people in the city was one thing. Loving those people, once they actually showed up, broken and messy and difficult and proud, was going to be something else entirely. Because the very next Sunday the room was not empty. Michael and Sarah had spent the week doing what they did best. They had knocked on doors. They had told their neighbors. They had told the man at the corner store, and the young mother 2 floors down, and the angry old veteran who never spoke to anyone. And when Daniel walked into that community center room on Sunday morning, he stopped dead in the doorway. There were not 4 chairs filled. There were 19 people crammed into a room built for 12 standing along the walls sitting on the floor. And Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, and his first feeling was not joy. His first feeling was terror. Because he looked at those 19 faces, and they were not what he had pictured when he prayed for a harvest. They were hard faces. Suspicious faces. A man in the corner with his arms crossed, daring Daniel to say one wrong thing. A woman who had clearly been crying before she came. 2 teenagers who looked like they had been forced there against their will. The angry old veteran sitting stiff and furious, as if he had come only to prove Daniel wrong. These were not the polished, grateful believers of his old small-town church. These were people the city had chewed up, people carrying wounds Daniel could not begin to imagine. People who had walked in that door with their guard up and their fists half clenched. And a voice inside Daniel whispered the most dangerous thought he had yet faced. It whispered, "You prayed for a harvest. But you're not ready for these people. You don't know how to love them. They're too broken. You'll fail them, and it'll be worse than the empty room ever was." Daniel stood in that doorway, 19 wounded strangers staring back at him, waiting to see what he would do. And he realized with a jolt that turned his stomach cold that Paul had faced this exact moment too. That the church in Corinth, the one God had promised, the one filled with the many people God already owned, would turn out to be one of the most divided, prideful, difficult congregations in the entire New Testament. Getting the harvest was never the hard part. Loving it was. And Daniel Carter, standing frozen in that doorway with every eye in the room fixed on him, opened his mouth to speak, and for one terrible moment, no words came out at all. Then Sarah caught his eye from the front row, and she mouthed 3 words. "Just say something." And Daniel closed his mouth. He set down his notes, the careful sermon he had prepared, 3 pages of polished points he had written the night before. He looked at those 19 hard faces, and he did the only thing he could think to do. He told them the truth. "I almost quit," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. 2 weeks ago, I stood on a sidewalk downtown with a cardboard sign, and one person came up to me all day, and he told me nobody needs what I have anymore. And I believed him. I packed a bag. I was going to leave this city and never come back. The room went still. The man in the corner with his arms crossed slowly uncrossed them. "I don't have anything impressive to give you," Daniel said. "I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I've got my life together. But I got a letter this week from a young man I met once. A young man I forgot about, and he told me he's alive today because of something I said and didn't even remember saying. And it made me realize something." He paused. "Every one of you walked in here today carrying something. I can see it, and I don't know your stories yet. But I know the God who sent me to this city, and he told me something I need you to hear. He said I have many people in this city. He didn't say I might. He said I have. Which means before any of you ever walked through that door, he already claimed you. He already knew your name. You're not here by accident." And the angry old veteran in the back, the one who had come only to prove Daniel wrong, made a sound low in his throat and turned his face away so no one would see it. Something broke open in that room, not neatly, not all at once, but something broke open. That was the beginning. Over the next weeks, the 19 became 30, and the 30 became 50. Word spread through the neighborhood the way it always does, one wounded person telling another. And Daniel learned their names, and their names became their stories, and their stories nearly broke his heart every single week. But here is what Daniel had not counted on. Here is the twist that no amount of prayer had prepared him for. Because a growing church is not the same thing as a healthy one. And the very people God had brought to him began almost immediately to tear at each other. It started small. 2 women stopped speaking over a disagreement about the coffee. A man complained that the music was too loud, and another complained it was too quiet, and both of them cornered Daniel after the service to demand he take a side. The teenagers formed their own clique and rolled their eyes at the older members. And then it got worse. One Sunday, Daniel walked in to find half the room sitting on one side and half on the other, like a wedding where the families hate each other. He learned that a rumor had gone around. 2 of the men had gotten into a shouting match in the parking lot the week before over money one had loaned the other, and now the whole congregation had chosen teams. Daniel stood in front of a divided room and felt the old despair claw its way back up his throat. He had prayed for people. God had sent people, and the people were pulling his church apart at the seams. That night, he sat at Michael and Sarah's kitchen table, the same table where this had all begun, and he put his face in his hands. "I don't understand," he said. "I begged God for this. And now that I have it, it's chaos. They fight. They gossip. They're proud, they're stubborn. Half of them won't even look at each other." He looked up. "Michael, I think I made a mistake. I think I loved the idea of a harvest more than I understood what a harvest actually is." And Michael, who had been quiet for a long time, finally spoke. "Can I tell you something about Corinth?" Daniel blinked. "What?" "The church Paul planted in Corinth. Michael said. The one God promised him, the one where God said, I have many people in this city. He leaned forward. Daniel, that church was a disaster. Daniel stared at him. You read the letters, Paul wrote them, Michael said. 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We treat them like beautiful scripture, and they are. But do you know why Paul wrote them? He wrote them because that church was falling apart. They were split into factions. One group following Paul, another following a preacher named Apollos, another following Peter, all of them arguing about whose leader was better. There was a man in the congregation living in open immorality, and instead of grieving it, they were proud of how tolerant they were. They were suing each other in public courts. They were getting drunk at the Lord's Supper while the poor among them went hungry. They were fighting over which spiritual gifts made a person more important. Michael shook his head slowly. The church at Corinth was one of the most messed up congregations in the entire New Testament, and it was the one God specifically promised. It was the harvest. Daniel could not speak. You think a harvest is a field full of perfect wheat, Michael said gently. But a real harvest comes in with dirt on it, with weeds tangled in, with rocks and mud and thorns. That's what a harvest is, son. It's not clean. God never promised Paul a clean church. He promised him people, and people are always a mess. And that was the moment the whole thing turned over in Daniel's mind, the truth he would carry for the rest of his ministry. He had believed without ever saying it out loud that his job was to find good people and gather them. But that was never the job. God does not call the qualified. God does not gather the finished. God takes the broken, the proud, the divided, the difficult, the ones the world threw away, and He does the slow, patient, painful work of transforming them. And He does that work through people like Daniel, who have to love them before they deserve it, because that is exactly how God loved us. The world sees a room full of arguing, wounded, prideful people, and calls it a failure. God sees the same room and calls it a family. He is not finished raising yet. So what did Paul do? Daniel asked, his voice thick. With a church like that. What did he do? Michael smiled. He didn't quit on them. That's the whole thing, Daniel. He corrected them hard sometimes. He was honest with them. But he never once told them they were too broken to belong to God. He wrote them the most famous words about love ever written. Do you know why? 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. We read it at weddings. But Paul didn't write it for a wedding. He wrote it for a church that couldn't stop tearing itself apart. He held up a mirror and said this. This is what you're missing. Not because they were beyond hope, because they were worth the fight. Daniel went home that night and did not sleep, but for the first time in weeks, it was not despair keeping him awake. It was resolve. The next Sunday, he stood in front of his divided room, the two sides still glaring at each other across the aisle, and he did something no one expected. He asked the two men who had fought in the parking lot to stand up. The room went dead silent. Everyone assumed he was about to shame them. Instead, Daniel stepped down off the platform, walked into the middle of that room and stood between the two men, and he said, I'm not here to find perfect people. If I wanted perfect people, I'd be in the wrong city, and honestly, I'd be the wrong pastor because I'm not perfect either. God didn't send me here to gather people who have it all figured out. He sent me here to love people who don't, including me. He turned to the first man. You loaned him money because you have a generous heart. That's a gift. He turned to the other. And you're carrying shame about not paying it back, which means you have a conscience, and that's a gift too. God can work with both of those. What He can't work with is two men who won't look at each other. And then Daniel did the thing that broke the room wide open. He took each of their hands, and he stood there, holding both of them in the middle of the aisle in front of everyone, and he waited. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then the first man turned to the second, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet, and he said the two hardest words a proud man can say. I'm sorry. And the whole room exhaled at once, like it had been holding its breath for weeks. The old veteran in the back stood up. Nobody had ever heard him speak. He had come to that church for 2 months and never said a single word to anyone, And now he stood, his voice rough and cracking, and he said, "I buried my wife last year. I haven't let anybody near me since. I came here to be angry." He stopped. His hands were shaking. "But I don't want to be angry anymore. I'm tired. I'm so tired of being alone." And a woman across the room, one of the two who had stopped speaking over the coffee, got up out of her seat, crossed the entire room, and sat down next to him. She did not say anything. She just sat down beside a grieving stranger, and she stayed. Daniel stood in the middle of his broken, beautiful, impossible church, and he understood at last what God had been trying to show him from the very first empty Sunday. This was the harvest. Not despite the mess. The mess was the harvest. Every wound in that room was a place where God was already at work. But even as Daniel stood there with tears running down his face, watching his divided church begin to knit itself back together, he did not yet know that the hardest test of his faith was still coming. Because in 3 weeks, a letter would arrive at that community center. Not from a grateful young man this time. This letter would come from the city itself, and it would threaten to shut everything down. The letter came on official letterhead, and Sarah found it first tucked into the community center's mailbox, and she carried it to Daniel with her face pale. He read it twice before he understood. It was from the property management company that owned the community center. The building had been sold. The new owners were converting it into luxury condominiums, and every current tenant, including the small church that met in the back room on Sunday mornings, had 90 days to vacate the premises. There would be no lease renewal. There were no exceptions. Daniel sat down on a folding chair and read it a third time, and the old familiar cold came creeping back into his chest. 90 days. He had fought so hard. He had begged God for this church, and God had given it, and now the city was going to take it away with a single piece of paper. "We'll find another space," Michael said, but his voice did not have its usual steadiness. "With what money?" Daniel said quietly. "Michael, we don't have a budget. We pass a basket, and it comes back with enough to buy coffee. We can't rent anything in this city. You know that." And for the first time, Michael did not have an answer. He just sat down beside Daniel and stared at the floor. That Sunday, Daniel had to tell them. He stood in front of his congregation, 50-some people now, the veteran who was no longer alone. The two men who had reconciled the woman who had crossed the room to sit beside a grieving stranger. And he told them the truth, because the truth was the only thing he had ever had to give them. He told them the building was gone. He told them he did not know where they would go, and he watched the fear ripple across their faces, and he hated it because he knew that fear. It was the same fear that had sent him packing a bag 2 weeks into his ministry. And then something happened that Daniel had not planned and could not have predicted. The old veteran stood up. He was becoming, Daniel had noticed, the sort of man who stood up now. And he said, "How much would it cost? To keep us together, a room, anything." Daniel shook his head. "It's not that simple. Rent in this neighborhood is more than any of us make." "How much?" the veteran said again. And Daniel, exhausted, told him a number that felt impossible. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope, and he walked to the front of the room, and he set it in Daniel's hands. "That's the money I was saving for my own funeral," he said. "Figured I'd be gone soon and alone, so I set it aside. But I'm not alone anymore, and I'd rather spend it keeping this family together than putting myself in the ground." He looked around the room. "I don't need a fancy funeral. I need these people." The room was absolutely silent. And then the woman who had sat down beside him weeks ago stood up, and she pulled off a ring, a small thing, and she said, "It's not worth much, but it's worth something. Take it." And she set it on top of the envelope. And then a young mother stood, the one who had come in those first weeks, with tears already on her face, and she said, "I clean houses. I can give up my 1 day off. I'll work Saturdays. Whatever it brings in, it's yours." One by one they stood. A man who fixed cars offered to repair vehicles for money to give. The two reconciled men, the ones who had fought over a loan, stood up together and said they would pool what they had. The teenagers, The ones who used to roll their eyes said they would find jobs. 50 broken people. The poorest congregation in the city, the harvest with dirt still on it, stood up one after another and gave what little they had to keep from being scattered. Daniel stood at the front, holding an old man's funeral money and a stranger's ring, and he could not speak. Because he was watching the exact thing Paul had written about happen in front of his eyes. He was watching a church that had been divided over coffee and money and pride become in the space of one desperate morning something that no amount of comfort could ever have produced. The very thing that threatened to destroy them was welding them together. And in that moment, Daniel finally understood the answer to the question that had haunted him from the very first day he stood on that sidewalk with a cardboard sign. He had asked, "Is this place really worth fighting for?" He had looked at a cold, proud, impossible city and wondered whether God had made a mistake sending him there. But the answer was standing all around him. The answer was an old man who was no longer waiting to die alone. The answer was two enemies who now stood shoulder to shoulder. The answer was a young man named Ethan, alive in another city, who would never know his name, was the reason Daniel had stayed. The city was never the point. The people were the point. The city had only ever been the field. The people were the harvest. And a harvest is always worth fighting for. They did not have enough money, not even close. The number they raised that morning was a fraction of what they needed. But Daniel took it anyway because he had learned something in Corinth's shadow that he had not known on that sidewalk. He had learned that faithfulness is not measured by whether you have enough. It is measured by whether you keep going with what little you have. He spent the next 3 weeks knocking on doors the way Michael had taught him. He walked into every church in the neighborhood, the struggling ones, the dying ones, and he asked if anyone had room. He was turned away again and again. And the old despair whispered that this was the door finally closing, that Pastor Wells had been right all along. But on the 4th week, Daniel walked into an old brick church 6 blocks away, a congregation of maybe 20 people, most of them gray-haired, meeting in a sanctuary built for 400. The pastor there was a woman named Ruth, near 70, who had been holding that dying church together with her bare hands for 30 years, watching it shrink one funeral at a time. Daniel told her his story. He told her about the eviction, about the 50 people, about the old man's funeral money. And Ruth listened without saying a word, and when he finished, her eyes were wet. "Young man," she said, "for 30 years I have prayed that God would send life back into this building before I died. I have watched it empty out. I have buried nearly everyone I started with, and I had begun to believe God had forgotten this place." She reached out and took his hand. "And now you walk in here telling me you have 50 people with nowhere to go." She started to laugh and cry at the same time. "Bring them. Bring all of them. This building has been waiting for you longer than you know." Daniel walked out of that old church and stood on the sidewalk, and he thought about God's words to Paul. "I have many people in this city." And he understood now that it had never just meant the lost people out in the streets. It had meant Ruth too. It had meant an old woman who had stayed faithful in an emptying building for 30 years, praying for a harvest she thought she would never see. God had been preparing her building for Daniel's people before Daniel ever set foot in Chicago. 2 prayers offered years apart by 2 people who had never met, answered in a single moment by a God who had been weaving them together the whole time. The 2 churches became one. Ruth's 20 gray-haired saints and Daniel's 50 wounded strangers. The old and the young, the dying congregation and the newborn one folded into each other in a sanctuary built for 400 that had sat half-empty for a generation. And it was not perfect. Of course it was not perfect. There were disagreements about the music again. There were the old members who missed the way things used to be, and the new members who did not know the old hymns. It was messy. It was a harvest, and a harvest always comes in with dirt on it. But it was alive. And Daniel standing in that sanctuary on the first Sunday, the 2 churches worshiped together, watching the old veteran teach a hymn to a teenager. Watching Ruth weep with joy in the front pew. Watching Michael and Sarah at the kitchen table of it all, finally saw what God had seen from the very beginning. He had arrived in this city, seeing only problems. God had seen people. He had seen darkness. God had seen a harvest already ripening in the dark. He had seen an impossible field. God had seen standing in it the many people he already called his own. Daniel had come to Chicago certain he was bringing God to a city that had forgotten him. He understood now at last that God had been in that city long before Daniel arrived and would have been there long after whether Daniel stayed or not. The miracle had never been that Daniel brought God to Corinth. The miracle was that God let Daniel be part of what he was already doing. And as Daniel stood to preach that morning to a room full of the broken and the healed and the grieving and the found, he realized there was only one thing left that he did not understand. One question that Paul's story and his own still had to answer. Because if all of this was true, if God really did have people waiting in every impossible city, then the question was no longer about Corinth at all. The question was about everyone listening. The question was about you. Daniel gripped the edges of the old wooden pulpit that morning, and instead of preaching the sermon he had prepared, he asked the room a question. How many of you, he said, walked in here the first time believing you were too far gone? The room went quiet. And then, slowly, hands began to rise. The old veteran's hand. The young mother's. The two men who had fought over money. The teenagers. Ruth's in the front pew trembling. And finally, nearly every hand in that sanctuary built for 400 was in the air. And Daniel felt his throat tighten because he understood that he was looking at a room full of people who had all at one point been certain that God was finished with them. Me too, Daniel said. I stood on a sidewalk downtown with a cardboard sign, and I believed a stranger who told me nobody needed what I had. I almost left this city. I almost missed all of you. He looked out over them. Every single one of you was already God's before you ever walked through a door. He had you the whole time. He was just waiting for someone to stay long enough to find you. And that was the moment Daniel finally turned to the question that had been building underneath this entire story. The question he now understood had never really been about Corinth at all. Because Paul's story in Corinth is not a museum piece. It is not a nice ancient tale about a faraway city that stopped mattering 2,000 years ago. It is a mirror. And the person it is holding up is you. You have a Corinth. Everyone does. Maybe your Corinth is a workplace where you are the only one who still believes anything, where they roll their eyes when you mention your faith, where you feel like a fool for hoping. Maybe your Corinth is your own family, a dinner table where you sit surrounded by people and still feel completely alone, where the person you have prayed for the longest is the person who wants nothing to do with what you believe. Maybe your Corinth is a neighborhood, a city, a nation that seems to be sliding further from God every year, and you have started to wonder whether your prayers are hitting the ceiling and falling back down. And maybe, if you are honest, your Corinth is the one you carry inside your own chest. The part of you that is convinced you are too old, now too tired, now too broken, too far behind, that your best years of serving God are behind you, and there is nothing left worth offering. If that is you, then hear the message that carried Paul through the impossible city. Hear the message that reached Daniel at midnight, that reached an old veteran saving for his own funeral, that reached a dying church that had been praying for 30 years. Do not be afraid. Keep speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you. I have many people in this city. The temptation in every Corinth is always the same. It is to leave, to go quiet, to decide the field is empty and the fight is over, and you might as well stop trying. That temptation whispered to Paul in the dark. It whispered to Daniel on a sidewalk. And it is whispering to someone listening right now. Someone who has one hand hovering over the decision to give up on a person, a place of prayer they have carried for years. But here is the truth that Paul staked his life on, and that Daniel discovered in the shadow of Corinth. God does not send his people where the work is easy. He sends them where the need is greatest. The hardest place is not the sign that you took a wrong turn. Very often the hardest place is the exact place God has been preparing the deepest roots and the greatest harvest, precisely because it is hard. Precisely because no one else would stay. The world looks at a difficult marriage and sees a lost cause. God sees a person worth pursuing. The world looks at a prodigal child and sees failure. God sees a future he has already written. The world looks at an aging body and a tired heart and says your season is over. God looks at that same faithful soul and sees someone who has learned exactly the kind of patience and love that a broken world is starving for. The world sees an empty field. God sees a harvest that has not been picked yet, and you do not need to be powerful to be part of it. That is the thing this whole story has been trying to tell you. Daniel was not famous. He was not wealthy. He had no platform, no budget, nothing but a dry marker and a piece of cardboard and a stubborn refusal to leave. Paul came to Corinth in weakness and fear and trembling. Michael and Sarah were nobody special, just a couple with a kitchen table and 2 extra chairs. Ruth was one old woman holding a dying church together with her bare hands. An old veteran had nothing to give but the money he was saving to bury himself. None of them were powerful. They were only faithful. And faithful, it turns out, is enough. Faithful is what God has always used to change the world. Because sometimes one person who simply refuses to give up can change an entire city. Sometimes one person who stays when everyone else leaves becomes the reason a whole harvest gets brought in. Daniel learned that his job was never to find perfect people. God does not choose perfect people. If he did, he would have no one to choose. Look at the church at Corinth, divided and proud and immoral and arguing, and remember that this was the church God specifically promised. God does not gather the finished. He transforms the imperfect. He takes the harvest with the dirt still on it, the weeds still tangled in, and he does the slow, patient, loving work of making it his. And he does that work through ordinary, tired, faithful people who are willing to love the broken before they deserve it. Which means every one of us is qualified, not because we are good enough, but because he is. Somewhere out there right now in your workplace, in your family, in your neighborhood, there is an Ethan. There is a young person 3 days from giving up who does not need a perfect sermon or a powerful speaker. They just need one faithful voice to remind them that God still cares, that they are not thrown away, that they were his the whole time and never knew it. And you may be the only voice God has positioned close enough to reach them. You are not where you are by accident. Your workplace is not random. Your neighborhood is not random. The difficult people around your dinner table are not random. These are not obstacles in your way. They are your mission field. God may have placed you exactly where you are in the exact Corinth you have been begging him to let you leave, because someone there is waiting to hear the message that only you carry. Daniel finished preaching that morning, and the old brick church that had been dying for 30 years was full of the sound of people who had been found. Ruth was weeping in the front pew. The veteran had his arm around the young mother's shoulder like a father. Michael and Sarah sat in the back holding hands, watching a harvest they had prayed over for 11 years come home. And Daniel stood at the pulpit and thought about the man who had told him on a downtown sidewalk that nobody needed this anymore. He had been so certain, and he had been so wrong. Because the truth is that the world has never needed it more. In every age, in every impossible city, in every cold and proud and broken place that looks the farthest from God, there are people waiting. There are the many that God has already called his own. And he is still looking in every generation for the ones who will refuse to give up long enough to find them. So this is the question this story leaves in your hands, and it is the only question that has ever mattered. God has already told you he has many people in your city. He has already promised he is with you. The only thing still unwritten is what you will do with the Corinth he has placed you in. Will you leave? Will you go silent? Will you decide the field is empty and walk away 1 week before the harvest comes in? Or will you stay? Because the place that looks the farthest from God is exactly where he is preparing the greatest transformation. The hardest ground is where he plants the deepest roots. And the impossible city is not your punishment. It is your calling. Do not be afraid. Keep speaking. Do not be silent, for God is with you. And he still has many people in this city waiting for someone faithful enough to stay.